Jax Miller used to say that the Navy didn't just teach you how to work a flight deck. It taught you how to live in small spaces without losing your mind. But sitting in the driver's seat of a 2008 Jeep with a cracked windshield and every possession he owned stuffed into the back, Jax realized the Navy hadn't prepared him for this. At 54, Jax was a ghost in his own country. He wasn't a hero anymore. He was just another guy in a faded ball cap, trying to figure out if he had enough gas to make it to the next rest stop, or enough pride to ask for a handout. Beside him, Shadow shifted his weight. Shadow was an 85-pound German shepherd, with a coat the color of a rainy midnight and eyes that seemed to know exactly how much money was left in Jax's checking account. He wasn't just a pet. Shadow was a retired working dog, a fur missile, who had seen more than his fair share of dark nights. When Jax's life had folded like a cheap lawn chair, first the job, then the wife, then the house, Shadow was the only one who didn't look at him with pity. He just looked at him with duty. "Hungry, big guy?" Jax muttered, his voice raspy from a night spent breathing in the cold Oregon dampness. Shadow didn't bark. He just rested his heavy chin on Jax's shoulder. That was the Navy way. No complaints, just the mission. The mission today was desperate. Jax had heard about a caretaker's lease in a small coastal town called Thorns Bay. The state was auctioning off the lease for the old Cape Mercy Lighthouse. The price, $1. It had been abandoned since 1978. It was miles from the nearest grocery store. And local legend said the place was so haunted, even the seagulls wouldn't land on it. The town of Thorns Bay looked like a postcard that had been left out in the rain for 40 years. Gray docks, gray water, gray people. Jax pulled into the town hall. Shadow's head out the window, ears up, patrolling. Inside, a clerk named Martha looked Jax up and down. She saw the Navy veteran patch on his jacket, and the way he stood, shoulders back, feet apart, like he was expecting the floor to tilt. "You want Cape Mercy?" she asked, her voice skeptical. "Honey, that place isn't a house. It's a pile of bricks, held together by spite and bird droppings. Why would a man like you want to go out there?" "Because for $1, Martha, I don't have to worry about the landlord asking why my dog is too big for the apartment." 10 minutes later, Jax walked out with a heavy brass key and a map that looked like it had been drawn during the Civil War. As he drove toward the coast, the trees started to thin out, replaced by jagged cliffs and the roar of the Pacific. And then he saw it. Cape Mercy. It was a white stone cylinder rising out of the mist like a jagged tooth. The paint was peeling in long, jagged strips. The iron gallery at the top was rusted red, and the small keeper's cottage attached to the base had half its windows boarded up with salt-crusted plywood. It looked lonely. It looked broken. It looked exactly like Jax felt. Shadow didn't wait for Jax to open the door. The moment Jax hopped out, the German shepherd was at the perimeter. He didn't run like a normal dog. He moved in a tactical sweep, sniffing the air, his tail low and steady. He stopped at the front door of the cottage and let out a low, vibrating growl that Jax felt in his own teeth. "Easy, Shadow. It's just old wood," Jax whispered. He turned the key. The lock groaned a metallic scream that echoed up into the tower. The air inside smelled like a century of wet salt and extinguished lanterns. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of light, cutting through the cracks in the boards. It was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your marrow and stays there. Jax walked through the small kitchen, his boots thudding on the warped linoleum. He found an old cast-iron stove, a heavy oak table, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen a flame since the Nixon administration. Shadow, however, wasn't interested in the kitchen. He was standing in the middle of the small living area, his eyes locked on the far wall. The fireplace was large, built of heavy river stones, but the chimney above it had been crudely sealed with thick gray mortar and extra bricks as if someone had been in a massive hurry to hide it. Shadow walked up to the sealed chimney. He didn't sniff it. He just stared. His ears flattened against his head, and he let out a sharp, urgent bark. "Shadow, knock it off," Jax commanded. "We've got work to do. We need to get the generator running before the sun goes down, or we're sleeping in the dark." But Shadow didn't move. He barked again, 3 sharp rhythmic bursts. In the K9 world, that was a signal. Threat detected. Investigation required. Jax ignored him. He spent the next 4 hours hauling his few belongings inside. He found the old diesel generator in a shed behind the tower. It was a beast from the 50s, smelling of grease and old pride. Jack spent an hour cleaning the injectors and coaxing the engine to life. When it finally roared, coughing out a cloud of black smoke, the lights in the cottage flickered to life. Dim, yellow, and shaky, but they were lights. That night, Jack sat at the oak table, eating a tin of cold beans by the glow of a single bulb. The wind was howling outside, slamming against the stone tower like a giant's fist. It was a sound Jax knew from his days on the carrier. The ocean reminding you that you were just a guest. Shadow was still by the chimney. He hadn't touched his food. He was lying down now, but his head was up, his amber eyes fixed on the gray mortar. Every few minutes, his nose would twitch, and he'd let out a soft, confused whine. "Go to sleep, dog," Jax muttered. He rolled out his sleeping bag on the floor near the stove. He expected to lie awake, listening to the ghosts of his past, but the sound of the ocean was a lullaby he had missed for too long. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. He woke up at 3:14 a.m. to the sound of scratching, not the soft scratching of a dog wanting to go out, but a frantic, desperate clawing. Jack sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for a flashlight. He clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on Shadow. The German Shepherd was on his hind legs, his powerful front paws tearing at the gray mortar of the sealed chimney. "Shadow, down, stay," Jax yelled, his Navy authority snapping back into place. Shadow ignored him. He was in a frenzy. He was barking now, a deep booming sound that shook the small room. He looked back at Jax, his eyes wide, then lunged at the wall, his teeth baring as he bit at the loose bits of stone. "What is wrong with you?" Jack scrambled to his feet. He grabbed Shadow's collar, trying to pull him back, but the dog was a mountain of muscle. Shadow wasn't being aggressive toward Jax. He was trying to get through that wall. Then, Jax heard it. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't the wind. It was a faint, metallic tink, 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 coming from behind the bricks. It sounded like a chain rattling against stone. Jax froze. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He pressed his ear to the mortar. The sound stopped. Then, a low, hollow groan echoed from deep within the chimney flue, followed by a sudden, sharp crack. Shadow lunged one last time, throwing his entire weight against the center of the sealed masonry. The wall didn't just crack. It gave way. The old mortar, brittle from decades of salt air and neglect, disintegrated. A section of stones, the size of a man's torso, collapsed inward, crashing into the hearth in a cloud of gray dust and soot. Jax jumped back, shielding his eyes. Shadow didn't flinch. He stood in the dust, his tail finally wagging, a low huff of satisfaction escaping his lungs. Jax waited for the dust to settle, his flashlight beam trembling. He expected to see an old bird's nest, or maybe a blocked flue. Instead, the light hit something reflective. Hidden inside the hollow space behind the false wall was a heavy, olive-drab blocker. It was a Navy-issue flight chest, reinforced with steel bands. It wasn't just sitting there. It was suspended by a thick, rusted chain hooked to a crossbeam deep inside the chimney. That was the rattling Jax had heard. Jax's breath hitched. He knew that chest. He had seen hundreds of them on the hangar deck. This one was different, though stenciled in fading white letters across the top was a name. Admiral Harlan Thorne. Jack sat back on his heels, the dust settling on his shoulders. Harlan Thorne, the man the bay was named after, a legend in naval intelligence who had disappeared under a cloud of mystery in the late 70s. Some said he'd defected. Others said he'd just walked into the ocean. With trembling hands, Jax reached into the hole and grabbed the handle. The chest was heavy. He hauled it out onto the floor. Shadow sat beside him, alert, his ears swiveling toward the front door. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" Jax whispered, scratching Shadow's ears. Shadow just licked Jax's hand. His job finally done. Jax pulled a multi-tool from his pocket. The lock was a heavy brass padlock, green with corrosion, one hard twist, and the mechanism snapped. He lifted the lid. The smell of old paper and cedar wafted out. On top lay a neatly folded American flag, its stars yellowed with age. Beneath it were stacks of leather-bound journals, a service pistol wrapped in oiled cloth, and a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. Jax picked up the envelope. On the front, in sharp military script, were the words, "To the one who finds. This trust the dog, but not the town." Jax felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Oregon wind. He opened the top journal. The date started in 1975. As he read, the history of Thorne's Bay began to rewrite itself. Admiral Thorne hadn't disappeared. He had been hiding. He had discovered that a group of local businessmen and politicians, men whose sons now ran the town, had been using the Cape Mercy Lighthouse as a signaling point for a massive smuggling operation during the height of the Cold War. They weren't smuggling drugs, they were smuggling stolen Navy technology. Thorne had gathered evidence, but he realized the rot went too deep. He couldn't trust the local police or even his own commanders. So he had hidden his findings here, in the one place everyone thought was cursed, and he had sealed it behind the chimney of the keeper's cottage. But there was more. Jax turned a page, and his heart stopped. There was a list of names. Men who had been paid off, families who had built their empires on the Admiral's silence, and at the very top was the name Elias Thorne. Jax recognized the name. Elias Thorne was the developer who currently owned half the town and was pushing the state to tear down the lighthouse to build a luxury resort. Suddenly, the $1 lease didn't seem like a lucky break for a homeless veteran. It felt like a trap. They wanted someone they thought was broken, someone who wouldn't ask questions, to stay here until the demolition crews arrived to bury the evidence forever. Shadow let out a sudden sharp growl. Jax looked up. Through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, he saw the sweep of headlights. A dark SUV was pulling up the long gravel drive toward the tower. "Company," Jax whispered. He didn't panic. You don't spend 20 years in the Navy without learning how to handle a breach. He stuffed the journals and the envelope back into the chest. He grabbed the service pistol, checked the action, smooth as silk, and looked at Shadow. "Shadow, perimeter, go." The German Shepherd moved like a shadow himself, slipping into the darkness of the hallway near the back door. Jax clicked off his flashlight and retreated into the kitchen, his back against the cold stone wall. The front door groaned. 2 men walked in. They were dressed in expensive hunting gear, carrying heavy-duty flashlights. "The generator's on," one of them said. His voice was oily, confident. "Our new tenant is home." Elias said to keep it quiet. The second man replied, "Just get the chest from the chimney and get out. If the vet wakes up, tell him we're here for a safety inspection." They saw the collapsed wall. They saw the empty hole. "It's gone," the oily voice whispered, panic rising. "He found it." "He didn't just find it," Jax said, stepping into the light, the heavy Navy chest at his feet and the service pistol held steady in a low ready position. "He's reading it." The 2 men froze. Their flashlight beams hit Jax, highlighting the gray in his hair, and the cold, flat stare in his eyes. "Mr. Miller," the first man said, trying to regain his composure, "you're making a big mistake. That chest is private property." "It belongs to the Thorne family. It belongs to the Navy," Jax corrected. "And judging by what's in here, your boss, Elias, has been waiting a long time to get his hands on it. Why? Is he worried about the treason charges? Or just the back taxes?" The second man's hand drifted toward his waistband. "I wouldn't do that," Jax said softly. "I'm not the only one in this room who doesn't like intruders." On cue, a low, guttural snarl erupted from the darkness behind them. Shadow stepped out, his teeth bared, his eyes fixed on the man's throat. The man froze, his face turning the color of the gray mortar. "Here's how this is going to work," Jax said, his voice as hard as the lighthouse stone. "You're going to leave. You're going to tell Elias that the Navy is coming to Cape Mercy. And if I see so much as a shadow on this driveway before sunrise, my partner here is going to get a very late dinner." The men didn't argue. They backed out of the cottage, their eyes never leaving Shadow, and scrambled into their SUV. The gravel sprayed as they tore away into the mist. Jax didn't relax. He knew they'd be back, but they wouldn't be coming alone. He picked up the manila envelope and looked at the journals. He had a mission now. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a keeper. Over the next 3 days, Jax didn't sleep much. He used the old radio equipment in the tower to reach an old contact a Master Chief he'd served with, who now worked at the Pentagon. He sent photos of the journals via a satellite uplink he'd scavenged from his Jeep's old gear. The response was immediate. On the 4th morning, the mist was so thick you couldn't see the ocean, but you could hear the thrumming. Not a truck engine, a heavy rhythmic beat. Shadow's ears perked up. He let out a happy bark. 2 Black Hawk helicopters descended from the gray clouds, landing on the rocky plateau beside the tower. Men in tactical gear swarmed out, but they weren't local police. They were Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. Leading them was a man Jax recognized, Admiral Richard Vance. Vance walked up to Jax, his eyes scanning the rusted tower and the scarred German shepherd. "Petty, Officer Miller," Vance said, offering a hand. "I heard you found something that belongs to us." "I found a lot of things, Admiral," Jax said, shaking his hand. "But mostly, I found a reason to stay." The investigation that followed rocked the state. Elias Thorne and his associates were arrested within the week. The evidence in Admiral Harlan Thorne's journals didn't just reveal the smuggling. It revealed decades of land theft and corruption that had kept the local veterans in poverty while the elite grew rich. But the real story was the Lighthouse. The state tried to take the lease back, but Admiral Vance intervened. He pointed out that Jax Miller had saved a massive piece of naval history and protected classified intelligence. Under a special federal grant, the Cape Mercy Lighthouse was designated as a Veterans Heritage Site. Jax was appointed the permanent director. A year later, Cape Mercy didn't look like a jagged tooth anymore. The stone had been cleaned and repainted. The iron gallery sparkled under the sun, but it wasn't just a lighthouse. Jax had used the funds to turn the surrounding land into a retreat for retired working dogs and their handlers. The cottage had been expanded. There were now 5 German shepherds living on the grounds, all retired from service, all finding peace in the roar of the ocean. Jax stood on the gallery one evening, the great Fresnel lens rotating behind him, casting a powerful beam of light across the Pacific. Shadow was beside him, his fur silvering at the muzzle, his eyes watching the waves. Jax looked down at the town of Thorns Bay. It was changing. New businesses were opening, and for the first time in a generation, the people didn't look so gray. He reached down and scratched Shadow's ears. "We did it, boy." "We're not ghosts anymore." Shadow let out a soft woof and leaned against Jax's leg. They weren't just survivors. They were the watchmen. And as long as the light was burning at Cape Mercy, Jax Miller and Shadow knew that no one would ever be lost in the dark again. The $1 lighthouse hadn't just given Jax a roof, it had given him his soul back. And as he watched the light sweep across the water, Jax realized that sometimes you have to move into the most abandoned places in the world to find out that you were never really alone. Jax walked back inside and sat by the fireplace. The chimney had been rebuilt, but he'd left one stone loose, a secret spot for his own journals. He picked up a pen and started to write, Day 365. The light is bright, the dog is fed, and for the first time in my life, I'm home. Shadow curled up at his feet, letting out a long, contented sigh. Outside, the ocean roared, but inside, there was only peace. The mission was complete.